Hello there. Part one of this lecture is going to be about surveys and observation, and part two will cover sampling. First, with surveys. I'm pretty sure many of you have participated in surveys at some point or another, so let's look at what surveys entail. So, surveys are a type of measurement. It's a method of posing questions to people, and they can be in a variety of formats. You can have surveys taking place over the phone, you have in person interviews or focus groups. There are sometimes written questionnaires, and maybe probably the most common are surveys online. When it comes to surveys, construct validity is really important. Remember that construct validity has to do with the quality of our measurement. Surveys are a type of measurement, so in this lecture, I'll be talking about ways to enhance the construct validity of surveys. So first, let's talk about the pros and cons of using surveys. An advantage is that they're typically pretty easy in terms of the data collection and distribution process. It's not necessarily easy to make surveys, which we'll discuss, but they tend to be on the cheaper side, relatively speaking. You don't have to require people to be somewhere. Sometimes you do compensate participants for completing a survey, but in general, you can get a lot of data for a little bit of money. Surveys are used in a lot of basic research. In the type of research that I do, for example, has a lot to do with human behavior and experiences. And surveys are really the best way to collect the type of data that I need. There are some cons to using surveys, though. They're not necessarily give you a way to make causal inferences, and they tend to be biased based on the researcher and the participant. We'll talk a little bit about that. And they give you basic information. They're not in depth. All right, so in order to look at the construct validity of a survey, we need to look at how well the variable is measured. To do this, we need to determine that the questions are clear and straightforward to answer. Survey questions come in a variety of different formats. And the reason this is important is because the way that you ask a question on a survey will determine the kind of information you get and what you can say about that information. In other words, the type of questions you ask dictate how you can interpret the data that you get. So different types of question format. One includes open-ended questions. So in these types of questions, respondents can answer any way they like. So for example, if I just ask, what do you think of this class? The pro to this is that it provides research with a lot of rich information. For example, you get participants' honest, uninhibited responses. The drawback of this is that coding and categorizing the diverse array of responses that you can possibly get can be really time consuming. Other types of questions are forced choice questions. So in these types, participants provide their opinion by choosing from a set of options. And so these are easier to score and use the info for data analysis. The downside is that respondents can only answer according to the options that you provide. You don't know if they have another answer that you haven't listed for them. So the data is limited and biased based on the responses that the researcher provides. The next type we'll cover is Likert scale. And so Likert scale questions, people get a statement that they're asked to use a rating scale to reflect their degree of agreement. So a Likert scale is anchored by terms like strongly agree, strongly disagree, and usually there's a neutral option in the middle, or it'll say something like neither agree or disagree. And lastly, we have semantic differential format. In this format, respondents are asked to rate something on a numerical scale that's anchored by adjectives. For example, if I were to ask you on a scale of 1 to 5, how hard is this class, or how easy is this class? Next, we'll talk about question wording. So question wording is also really important in terms of construct validity. The questions on a survey should be worded very clearly so that you get valid, honest responses. Here are some pitfalls, and we'll talk about how to avoid them. So the first one is leading questions. This is when a question is not neutral. The way the question is worded includes some type of value, judgment, or suggestive language that leads the respondent. So an example of this is if I ask, do you agree that it is a terrible idea to legalize marijuana? So in this question, the word terrible is providing some type of suggestion. To fix this, you want to use neutral language in your questions, especially if they're open-ended. So I might say instead, what is your opinion on legalizing marijuana? The next pitfall is double-barreled questions or having two in one. So asking people, for example, do you enjoy long walks and taking exams? This is a problem because, what if someone likes one or the other? Then do you answer yes or no? It's not clear which construct is being measured. Is it long walks or taking exams? To fix this, you ask questions separately. The next one is negative wording. So we really want to we want our questions to be answered in a very straightforward way. That's the best way to protect your construct validity. And so the more cognitively difficult it is for people to answer a question, that can lead to a lot of confusion. So using negative language in questions is more difficult for respondents to process. So here's an example. Do you disagree that people should never be punished for a first offense? The way this question is worded, participants first have to take some time to decipher what the question is actually asking before they even get a chance to think about the responses. And that's not what you want. You want it to be as straightforward as possible. So I might change this phrase to some type of Likert type scale. And then lastly, question order. So question order is important because questions that occur early in the survey can influence the way that respondents interpret and even answer questions that come later on the survey. So the way to control for these types of order effects are to randomize the order in which the questions appear. So you make multiple versions of the questionnaire, and so you can account for those order effects. So for example, if I had this type of thing where I had, what's your favorite sport? And then I asked later, are you interested in playing on a softball team? The answer to the first question might inform someone's answer to the second question. So here's a fun comic that serves as an example of some faulty question wording. See if you can identify which pitfalls are illustrated here. All right, that brings us to the first part of workshop number 3. There are going to be 3 parts. I think you guys know what to do by now. You can pause this and complete the workshop before moving on to the next section. All right, another thing to think about with surveys is how do we encourage honest responses? Surveys are self-report, right? Researchers do want accurate answers from their respondents, but respondents are just people too who may or may not have the same motivation or interest to complete your survey or complete it honestly. There are certain response biases that can threaten construct validity. So we'll talk about those and what researchers can do to avoid them. So the first one is using shortcuts. Sometimes respondents use shortcuts when answering surveys. Maybe they want to finish them quickly, but this can really skew the data and make it difficult for researchers to extract meaningful data. One type of shortcut is response sets or non-differentiation. So, sometimes in surveys, a set of questions might be worded similarly, or they have the same types of response options. Well, a respondent might notice that and start to take shortcuts by answering all of the questions in the same way. So, for example, they might just be clicking strongly agree all throughout without actually reading the questions. So this weakens your construct validity because respondents aren't actually reporting what they really think. So you're not measuring what you think you're measuring. The way that you can fix this is by differentiating the response types. So maybe you mix up the types of questions, or the type of question formats. So maybe you don't have a whole survey full of Likert type questions. Another way you can address this is use reverse worded items. That just means you have a mixture of both, positive and negative statements. And this cues the respondents to have to read this survey carefully and think about their answers. So here's an example. Let's say you were giving a survey about personality or introversion and extroversion. So your scale could include these 2 questions. One is, I like to be the center of attention. Second one says, I'm uncomfortable when all eyes are on me. These questions are asking essentially the same thing, but respondents really have to pay attention. If they are paying attention, their answer cannot possibly be the same if they're consistent. An extroverted person, for example, would be answering strongly agree to the first question and strongly disagree to the second question. So, self reports or surveys are sometimes the only option. Sometimes they can be the best option depending on the information that you're trying to get. They're good for when you need to gather subjective information, not necessarily great when you need information on actual behavior or the influences for behavior. Self report is, again, a reasonable type of measure, but you tend to not be able to get to the root of all of the responses. There's also some other potential issues associated with self report data because, again, you have human respondents. So I'll go over those now. One is something called social desirability. Most of us tend to want to look good to other people. We want to maintain our self image. And so this can lead to social desirable responding. And this is when we're trying to, look better or stronger or more successful or happier on a survey. One way to avoid this is to make sure that participants are aware and, confirm that their responses are anonymous so that they can be as honest as possible. The other issue with self-reporting is that we're often asking people to, report more than they can actually know. And this is a question of whether or not people are capable of reporting accurately about their feelings, thoughts, and behavior. Some aspects of these things can be subconscious. So, if I were to ask why you buy a particular brand of clothing, you might not really know the deep reason why, but you can tell me something that sounds reasonable. Another issue with self report is just the idea that sometimes our memories are not as accurate as we like to think they are. We might feel very confident about what we report, even if it's not 100% accurate. So now that we've covered self-report and surveys, hopefully you have a better understanding of all that goes into it. There's a lot of planning and thought going into survey construction. When you make a good quality survey, there's a rhyme and reason to everything from how the questions are worded to the order in which the questions appear. And you really have to think about the best ways to reduce bias and enhance construct validity. In my work as an evaluator and a consultant, I've been hired to design surveys for different organizations and companies, and they pay really good money for this service because it takes a lot of planning and expertise. If you're interested in learning more about that, let me know. All right, I'm going to move on. Now we're going to talk about observations, which are a type of behavioral research. So, behavioral research is the process of watching people or animals, if that's what you're studying, and systematically recording how they behave and what they're doing. This is usually conducted in an environment where the behavior naturally occurs. So, there's no manipulation, it's supposed to be unobtrusive and non reactive. So there's some benefits to observations. They're not subject to the kinds of response biases that we discussed earlier with surveys. Like there's no order effects or issues with the questions or problems with people, memory and recalling past behavior because it's happening in real time. But there are some biases to be aware of as well, which we'll discuss now. So these are things that are going to threaten construct validity, and we're going to talk about after this how to address them. So one is observer bias, and this is when the observer's expectations influence how they interpret the behavior. So the observer or the researcher knows what they're looking for, and they know what their hypothesis is, and maybe they're just looking for evidence to support it. They're not really being objective. Observer effects is when the observer or the researcher does something that affects participant behavior. So these might be subtle cues. So a researcher might have certain facial expressions as they're observing. It might be the way they position their body, or they might even say something that influences how people are behaving or are supposed to be behaving naturally. And then there's reactivity, and this is when people change their behavior just by virtue of the fact that they know they're being watched. If you know that someone is watching you and observing you, you may not behave in the most natural way, and that could skew the validity of the observation. So, luckily, there's some ways to prevent these issues. One is to train observers, or usually these are research assistants. And one way to do that is to use code books. So, code books is a code book is a document that just kind of very specifically lays out how the behaviors should look and how to rate them and how to observe them. So this takes people outside of their own heads and gives them a guide. It increases the objectivity so that there's less assumption and less bias. The next is to definitely check inter-rater reliability. So you should definitely, anytime you're doing an observation, you should have multiple people observing and then make sure to test the inter-rater reliability. If the observations between the multiple raters are similar, then you can be more confident in the data. Next is you can have a blind design. So this is when the observer, the person, making the observations, do not know about the study. And they don't know about the hypothesis. So I have an example of this. When I was in undergrad, I was recruited to help observe children for a child development lab. And so I had to observe children at their elementary school in their classroom and during recess. I didn't know exactly why I was coding children's behavior or what the actual goals or the hypothesis of the study was. I just had a code book and I was trained on what to look for and how to take the notes. And so I wasn't biased about what I was looking for. Whereas if someone who was more involved in the lab or the researchers were doing these observations, they might be biased in their observations. Now we'll talk about how to prevent reactivity. Remember that reactivity is when the participants are reacting to being watched. This is when people change their behavior in some way because they know someone is watching them. So let's say you wanted to do some observational research at a preschool setting. If you just simply walked in one day and sat down in the classroom and began your observations, the children or the teacher might change their behavior in a variety of ways that don't reflect how they naturally act. So children might be curious about what you're doing there. They might ask you questions. They might be afraid of you. The teacher might feel that their teaching is being assessed. And this threatens construct validity because you can't measure what you actually want to measure if people aren't behaving like as they naturally behave. So there's different solutions to this. One is you can try to blend in, make yourself less obvious by, maybe sitting in the back of the classroom or, maybe being in an adjacent classroom or behind a one-way mirror so that the participants can't see you, but you can see them. And the goal is just to be unobtrusive. So that prevents reactivity. Another thing you can do is wait it out. Sometimes it's a good idea to have research participants get used to your presence. So in our preschool example, you might sit in on the class for a couple of days and then not actually start recording your observations or doing your data collection until the third day, so that by then they're used to you being there and they're acting in the most natural way. And then lastly, something you could do is to measure the behavior indirectly. So you measure results of the behavior instead of the actual behavior. So some example of this is maybe if you were interested in the amount of junk food that college students eat in their dorms. Well, it would be very obvious if you were sitting in dorm rooms looking at them and taking notes. Instead of watching people eating junk food, you could look at the wrappers of junk food in the dorm room garbage cans. So this is an indirect way of doing behavioral observation. So here's part 2 of workshop number 5. You can go ahead and pause and complete that. Now might also be a good time to take a break because we're going to move on to the next lecture topic. Okay, our second lecture for today is on sampling. So let's start with a quick review about what a sample is. A population, first of all, is all of the individuals of interest, everybody who I'm interested in. And so a lot of times you can't do research on every single individual in the population, but you can obtain a sample. A sample is a subset of the population that you collect data from. Every study has a population of interest, and this is the population to which you want to generalize your findings. Lots of times you have to get very specific about this because the sample that you get is going to determine the scope of your generalizability. If you think back to the validities, the one that relates most closely to this is external validity. Remember, that's all about to whom we can generalize our findings. Getting a representative sample is best. But a lot of times we settle for a biased samples because that's all we can get. We don't always have all the time and resources in the world to get a truly non-biased representative samples. But I'm going to now talk about the difference between a representative sample and a biased sample. So here's a nice graphic showing you the different types of sampling. This also is in your book. On the left of the graphic, you have examples of representative sampling techniques. And representative sampling just means that all members of a population have an equal chance of being included in the sample. You can imagine how difficult that might be depending on the size of the population that you're interested in. If you have a very huge population that you want to generalize to, let's say I want to generalize my findings to U.S. college students. Well, I need to get a sample from colleges across the United States and have all college students be equally able to participate in my study. So you can see how that can be difficult depending on your population. And then in biased samples, some people are systematically left out for a variety of reasons. It could be for time, resources, or maybe it might be because of the difficulty of sampling people from the population of interest. Maybe they're hard to find or hard to contact. Maybe you just have a limited scope of participants that you need to get. So in this lecture, I'm going to highlight a few of these, starting with some sampling techniques for a biased sample. One is a convenience sample. And this is most commonly used in behavioral research. For example, for my doctoral dissertation, I collected data from GSU students. So I attended the school, and there's a pool available of GSU college students who usually are in psychology classes and take surveys for credit. And so that's what was available to me. And so that was a convenient sample that I used for my survey. There's also such thing as a self-selected sample, and so these are people who volunteer to provide feedback or volunteer for a survey. You might see a survey online and decide to, take it and things like that. So that's self-selected sample, are people who volunteer to take a survey. The next is a snowball sample. So this is based purely on referrals. For example, participants who take an online survey might be asked to forward the link to their friends or forward to other people, or give their contact information of the researchers to other people to participate in the study. So this, just goes on and on like a snowball, increasing the sample size as people keep referring their friends. This type of sampling is really helpful when your population of interest might be difficult to contact, or maybe you don't have the connections within that community, or even for other reasons. For example, I've done research before with our population of interest was immigrants of color. And that's a population that might not necessarily always be trusting of institutions or research, especially depending on their immigration status. And also because we were asking some personal questions in our research. So it was beneficial to use this type of sampling technique. So we had people in our study recommend us to their friends and family members because they would trust them more and then be confident in, taking our survey. Okay, now we'll talk about some representative sampling techniques. The goal of representative sampling, again, is so that you create a sample that represents all of your population. It gives everyone an equal chance of being selected into the sample. It's also called probability sampling because, again, every member in the population of interest has an equal chance of being selected. So the first is simple random, and this is completely at random. So this is the basic type of random selection. It's basically like drawing names of a hat. So let's say I wanted to do a phone survey to understand political attitudes of people in Fulton County. So if I had a phone number for everyone in the county, I would enter the phone numbers into some type of random sorting or random sampling generator, and then I would just call that random sample. That way, there's no bias or preference for people in certain part of the county. This way I can be more confident when I say that my results represent Fulton County because I know that everybody from Fulton County was represented in the survey. Okay. The next one I'm going to talk about is cluster sampling, and that's when I break my population down into smaller groups. You can use this type of sampling when your population of interest naturally occurs in groups. So, for example, let's say my population of interest is churchgoers on Main Street, and there's 5 churches on Main Street. So these 5 little clusters of different colors represent the 5 churches. So to do cluster sampling, I would break down this population to smaller groups. So I would take from those 5 churches, I would randomly select 2 of those churches. So those are the ones that are circled. And then I would sample all the churchgoers in just those 2 churches. Multi-stage sampling is a further derivative of cluster sampling, where instead of sampling all the churchgoers in the randomly selected clusters, I would then randomly select churchgoers within those clusters. In systematic sampling, I would randomly select 2 numbers or 1 number even, and I will use those numbers to then select from my group of participants. Okay, so for all of you visual learners, I'm hoping that this is going to help to illustrate some of the sampling techniques. You're going to see some silly little illustrations on the screen. I use smiley faces of different types to represent people in a population. So I'm hoping that this helps you visualize these types of sampling techniques. So for simple random, again, is just randomly picking people out of the population. So here's a random selection, here's a random selection of people. We can do this type of sampling using some type of random number generator. Essentially, again, it's like picking people out of a hat. With systematic random, one way to do this is by, picking random numbers and then selecting from there. So let's say that this is my population. So you see this array of people, this is my population. So I would randomly select 2 numbers. Let's say I select numbers 3 and 7. And so how this works is that I'll start with a 3rd person, that's where the 3 comes in, and then I'll select every 7th person in the population after this. So watch this illustration, pay attention so you don't miss it. All right, hope that helped to visualize systematic. Okay, a convenient sample is when you sample who is most easily available to you. And so that might just be a small subsection of the population that you can get your hands on. All right, self-selection. I like to think of self-selection as whoever shows up to the party. Remember, that is volunteer-based. Okay, so let's illustrate this cluster technique again. Let's say I'm going to do a study on college students in a small town. And in this small town, there are 4 colleges. So you see these 4 clusters here, that represents the 4 colleges. I'm going to randomly select 2 of those colleges, again, using some type of random number generator or something like that. And then I would survey all of the students in those 2 schools. In multi-stage, I would also, randomly select 2 clusters, but instead of sampling everyone, I would randomly select participants within those 2 schools. And then lastly, remember that the snowball sampling is the referral technique where your participants tell a friend and they tell a friend and they join your survey. Here's a table just giving you some examples of biased versus representative sampling techniques for different scenarios. This is in your book too. I want to highlight here that biased sampling is okay. We just have to be careful about how we interpret the data and what we say about who our study represents or who our results represent. And you want to be careful when you're critiquing research or looking at any type of research. You want to check to see, okay, who are they saying this applies to versus who did they actually include in the study? Because those things should match up. Okay, I like this last example in this table because it might be relatable to you all. So let's say you want to get reviews on Professor A, and you want to sample students to get their feedback. Well, one technique is you could use a website that like Write My Professor, where students who have taken a class with a professor, they go on there and they leave their reviews. Well, this is a biased sampling technique because those students volunteer. This is self-selection. So they volunteer to go on that website and leave their feedback. To get a representative sample, you could get a list of all of the students, current and former students that Professor A has taught, and then you can select every 15th student for the study. That would be an example of systematic random sampling, where all participants or all of your population of interest has an equal chance of being in a survey because you're randomly selecting them. So now you can pause to do the last part of workshop 5. Also, if you continue watching the video, I've included some practice test questions for your review.